There is a shadow fact that the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation rarely mentions in their glossy quarterly reports. It is the rent-induced poverty line, a mathematical threshold where the cost of shelter doesn't just eat your disposable income, it consumes your future. Most Canadians are told that spending 30% of their gross income on rent is the gold standard for financial health. But in 2024, in cities like Toronto, Vancouver, and even once affordable hubs like Halifax, that number has mutated. We are now seeing a generation of professionals, nurses, teachers, and tech workers handing over 50%, 60%, or even 70% of their take-home pay to a landlord just to keep a roof over their heads. This isn't just a housing crunch. It is a fundamental restructuring of the Canadian social contract. You were promised that if you worked 40 hours a week, you could build a life here. But as you sit in your 450-square-foot condo in Liberty Village, watching the sun set over a skyline you'll never own a piece of, you realize the game has changed. The curiosity gap here isn't just about why prices are high. It's about where that money is actually going. Is it going to your landlord's mortgage? Or is it fueling a massive institutional machine that benefits from your permanent status as a renter? Stay with me, because what we found in the data suggests that the peak isn't even in sight yet. The visceral pain of the Canadian rental market is best felt on the first of every month. It's that sinking feeling when you check your Scotiabank or TD app and see your balance plummet before you've even had your first coffee. For many in the Greater Toronto Area, the average rent for a one-bedroom has surpassed the $2,500 mark. If you're making the median Canadian salary of roughly $63,000, your net monthly pay after the CRA takes its mandatory bite is approximately $3,900. After rent, you're left with $1,400 for everything else. Groceries at Loblaws or Sobeys have seen prices jump by 20% in some categories. Your phone bill, your car insurance, among the highest in the developed world, and your student loans leave you with exactly zero at the end of the month. This is the financial cage. You are working 160 hours a month just to stand still. The stress is physiological. It's a tightness in the chest that doesn't go away. You aren't just paying for a place to sleep. You are paying a survival tax to exist in your own country. But here is the open loop. Why is it that as the Bank of Canada holds or raises rates, your rent only seems to go in one direction? We're told high rates cool the market, yet the rental market is boiling over. There's a missing link in the supply chain that no one is talking about.
Let's talk about the disappearing middle class. In the 1980s and 90s, the Canadian middle class was defined by the ability to save. You rented to save for a house. Today, renting is the reason you can't save for a house. It's a paradox that has trapped millions in a cycle of perpetual leasing. The Canadian dream has been replaced by the Canadian grind. You see it in the eyes of the people on the GO train or the Sky train, the look of exhaustion, not from work, but from the mental gymnastics trying to make the math work. The gap between the haves who bought property pre-2015 and the have-nots who are renting now is widening into a canyon. This isn't just about economics, it's about the erosion of hope. When you realize that even if you saved $500 a month, which is nearly impossible for most, it would take you 30 years to save a down payment for an average home in the GVA, the spirit breaks. This creates a shadow economy, where people are forced into illegal basement apartments or overcrowded rooming houses just to survive. We investigated the rise of these hotbedding arrangements in Brampton and Surrey, and what we found was a level of desperation that mimics developing nations, not a G7 country. Why is the government allowing the floor to fall out from under the feet of its most productive citizens?
The role of the Bank of Canada is often discussed in abstract terms, but for the Canadian renter, Tiff Macklem's decisions are personal. When the BOC raised interest rates to combat inflation, they inadvertently lit a fire under the rental market. Landlords, many of whom are over-leveraged with variable rate mortgages on investment properties, didn't just absorb those costs, they passed them directly to you. This is the rate migration effect. As it became more expensive for people to buy homes, would-be buyers stayed in the rental market longer, increasing demand. Simultaneously, landlords hiked rents to cover their soaring interest payments. It's a double-edged sword that cuts the renter both ways. You are priced out of buying, and you are squeezed while renting. This has led to a surge in N12 and N13 evictions, the infamous rent-eviction, where landlords claim they need the unit for personal use or renovations, only to relist it weeks later for $800 more. The legal system, meant to protect tenants, is backed up for months, leaving families in a state of constant housing insecurity. The question we have to ask is the system broken, or is it working exactly as intended for those at the top? There's a specific policy hidden in the tax code that incentivizes this behavior, and most Canadians have never heard of it. To understand the true depth of the crisis, we have to look at the Loblaws factor. It's not just that rent is high, it's that the cost of staying alive while paying that rent has become predatory. The average Canadian family is now spending significantly more on basic staples than they were just 3 years ago. When you combine the highest rents in history with some of the most expensive groceries in the Western world, you create a disposable income vacuum. This vacuum is sucking the life out of local economies. People aren't going to movies, they aren't eating at local bistros, and they aren't investing in their TFSAs or RRSPs. They are simply transferring their wealth to a handful of corporate entities: the big landlords, the big grocers, and the big banks. This concentration of wealth is uniquely Canadian. In the US, there is more competition. In Europe, there are more renter protections. In Canada, we have a polite oligopoly that manages our decline. The emotional toll of choosing between a healthy grocery cart and making rent is a reality for 1 in 4 Canadians, according to recent food bank data. But there is a silent player in this game that no one is watching: institutional investors. They aren't people, they are algorithms, and they are buying your neighborhood. Institutional investors, often referred to as corporate landlords, have fundamentally changed the DNA of Canadian real estate. These are real estate investment trusts, REITs, that own thousands of units across the country. Their primary fiduciary duty isn't to provide housing, it's to maximize shareholder value. This means every year, they must find ways to increase net operating income. How do they do that? By ensuring rents never stagnate. They use sophisticated software to analyze market data and push rents to the absolute limit of what the market can bear. When a REIT buys an older building in a place like Scarborough or Burnaby, they don't just maintain it, they reposition it. This is corporate speak for pushing out long-term tenants with lower rents to bring in new ones at market rates. They have legal teams that individual renters can't compete with. This financialization of housing means your home is no longer a shelter, it's an asset class on a balance sheet in a skyscraper in downtown Toronto. The curiosity gap here is, who owns these REITs? Often, it's the very pension funds that Canadians rely on for their retirement. We are essentially cannibalizing our current housing security to fund our future retirement, a cycle that benefits no one but the fund managers.
The renoviction nightmare is a story becoming all too common from Victoria to St. John's. It usually starts with a formal-looking letter under the door. The landlord claims they need to perform extensive renovations that require the unit to be vacant. Under provincial laws, like those in Ontario or BC, tenants have rights, but the process is skewed. A landlord can afford to wait. A tenant who is being kicked out needs a place to sleep next month. This desperation is a weapon. Many tenants take a small cash-for-key settlement just to avoid the stress of a landlord and tenant board hearing that could take a year to schedule. Once the tenant leaves, the renovation might be as simple as a coat of gray paint and new vinyl flooring. The unit is then put back on the market for 50% more. This is the gray paint economy. It's a gut punch to the community. Long-term residents who have built lives, sent their kids to local schools, and supported local shops are displaced to the fringes of the city, increasing their commute times and decreasing their quality of life. The psychological impact of housing instability is a ticking time bomb for the Canadian healthcare system, as chronic stress leads to a myriad of physical and mental health issues. Why is saving for a down payment now considered a math impossibility for the average renter? Let's look at the numbers. In the early 2000s, the average home price was roughly 3 to 4 times the average household income. Today, in our major centers, it's 10 to 12 times. While you are trying to save that 20% down payment, the goalposts aren't just moving, they're sprinting away. If home prices appreciate by 5% a year on $1 million home, that's $50,000. To keep pace, you need to save $50,000 a year just to keep your down payment percentage the same. That's more than many people's entire take-home pay. This has created a permanent renter class. The ladder has been pulled up. This leads to a visceral sense of betrayal among young Canadians. They did what they were told.
They went to university, they got the good jobs, and yet they are living with 3 roommates at age 30. The roommate economy is no longer just for students. It's the new reality for working professionals. This delay in housing security leads to a delay in everything else: starting a family, investing in a business, or simply feeling like a true stakeholder in the country. The math is broken, and no amount of cutting out Starbucks will fix a structural deficit of this magnitude. The CRA tax bite is the silent killer of the renter's budget. In Canada, we take pride in our social services, but the tax burden on the middle class is significant. When you look at your pay stub, you see deductions for federal tax, provincial tax, CPP, and EI. For a mid-career professional, that can be 30% or more of their earnings. Unlike homeowners who get the principal residence exemption, a massive tax-free gain when they sell their home, renters get almost no tax relief for their largest expense. There is no rent deduction on your T1. You are paying for your housing with after-tax dollars, while the system is designed to subsidize and protect the equity of those who already own. This tax asymmetry is one of the most overlooked aspects of the Canadian housing crisis. It effectively penalizes those who don't have the capital to buy, making it even harder for them to ever accumulate that capital. It's a systemic poverty trap disguised as a tax code. Why isn't there a tax credit for renters that scales with the cost of living? The answer lies in the voting power of the homeowner class, who have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. This creates a political divide that is starting to simmer beneath the surface of Canadian politeness. The shadow rental market is Canada's dirty secret. As official rents skyrocket, a secondary, unregulated market has exploded. We're talking about partitioned living rooms, 4 people to a bedroom, and illegal basement suites that don't meet fire codes. On sites like Kijiji and Facebook Marketplace, you'll find listings for shared beds or halves of rooms for $600 a month. This is happening in a G7 country. The desperation is so high that people are willing to overlook safety and privacy just to have a postal code. This shadow market is a direct result of the supply-demand imbalance. When the government brings in nearly 1 million people a year, between permanent residents, TFWs, and international students, without a corresponding plan for where they will sleep, the shadow market is where they end up. This puts an immense strain on local infrastructure. The power grid, sewage, and emergency services weren't designed for this density in suburban neighborhoods. It also creates a race to the bottom for living standards. If people are willing to pay for a mattress on a floor, what incentive do landlords have to provide quality housing? This erosion of the Canadian standard of living is perhaps the most painful part of this story, as we watch our cities transform into something unrecognizable. The social cost of this crisis is immeasurable. We are witnessing the delayed life phenomenon. In Canada, the average age of a first-time homebuyer is now in the mid-30s, and even then, it's often only possible with the bank of mom and dad. But what about those who don't have parents with home equity to tap into? They are delaying marriage, they are delaying having children, and they are delaying the pursuit of their dreams. The fertility rate in Canada has hit record lows, and while there are many factors, the inability to afford a multi-bedroom home is a primary driver. We are effectively trading our future demographics for current real estate valuations. The mental health crisis associated with housing insecurity is also peaking. The constant fear of a no-fault eviction or another 20% rent hike leads to chronic anxiety and depression. People feel like guests in their own country, unable to hang a picture on the wall or own a pet because of restrictive leases and the fear of upsetting a landlord. This lack of place attachment is social acid. It dissolves the bonds of community. When you know you might be priced out of your neighborhood next year, why bother getting to know your neighbors or volunteering at the local community center? Policy failures at every level of government have created a perfect storm. For decades, municipal zoning laws have favored the missing middle, or rather, the lack of it. It's either massive glass towers or sprawling single-family homes, with nothing in between. The red tape involved in building a simple apartment complex in Canada can take years and add hundreds of thousands of dollars in development charges to each unit. These costs are, of course, passed down to the renter. Federal policies that encouraged low interest rates for too long fueled a speculative frenzy, while provincial governments failed to invest in social housing. We are now decades behind where we need to be. The curiosity gap here is why, when the crisis is so obvious, is the needle moving so slowly? The answer is NIMBYism, not in my backyard. Existing homeowners who see their property values as their retirement fund often fight against increased density in their neighborhoods. They show up to city council meetings to block apartment buildings, citing neighborhood character. This creates a generational war, where the youth are sacrificed to protect the views and property values of the established. The Canadian politeness is wearing thin, as the younger generation realizes their future is being voted away at City Hall. The immigration versus infrastructure debate is a third rail in Canadian politics, but you cannot talk about rent without talking about population growth. Canada has one of the highest immigration rates in the world. While diversity is our strength, the math of housing is a hard reality. If you bring in 500,000 people, but only build 200,000 homes, rent will go up. It is basic supply and demand. The pressure this puts on the rental market is immediate. Newcomers often congregate in the same cities, Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal, where the jobs are. This creates a hyper-competitive environment, where landlords can demand 6 months of rent up front, credit scores that are impossible for newcomers to have, and employment letters that many don't yet possess. This leads to a secondary exploitation, where newcomers are gouged for substandard housing. It's a bait and switch. We invite people to the land of opportunity, only to have them spend their entire life savings on a basement in Brampton. The lack of coordination between federal immigration targets and municipal housing starts is a systemic failure that is hurting both natural-born Canadians and those who have just arrived. The curiosity gap here is who benefits from this high-growth, low-supply model. Hint, look at the companies that need cheap labor and the landlords who need high demand. The TFSA and RRSP are often touted as the keys to Canadian financial freedom, but for the modern renter, they can feel like a trap. When you are living paycheck to paycheck, the idea of investing is a luxury. Every dollar you put into an RRSP to save for a future that feels increasingly out of reach is a dollar you don't have for today's soaring rent. Furthermore, the Home Buyer's Plan, which allows you to withdraw from your RRSP for a down payment, is becoming obsolete because the withdrawal limit hasn't kept pace with home prices. You are essentially being told to save in a bucket with a hole in the bottom. Meanwhile, the inflation that is driving up your rent is also eroding the purchasing power of whatever small savings you do manage to squirrel away. This is the inflationary treadmill. You are running faster and faster, but the finish line, housing security, is moving away at twice your speed. The emotional weight of this is a quiet despair. It's the realization that the traditional financial advice given by parents and banks doesn't apply to the current reality. We need a new blueprint for survival in a high-rent Canada, and it starts with acknowledging that the old one is dead. Rural Canada was once the escape valve for those priced out of the cities. If Toronto was too expensive, you moved to Guelph. If Guelph was too much, you moved to Woodstock. But that valve has been welded shut. The work-from-home revolution during the pandemic saw a mass exodus of urban equity into small towns. People with Toronto salaries and Toronto home sale profits moved into rural communities, outbidding locals and driving up rents in places that had been stable for decades. Now, even in small-town Ontario or the BC interior, rents have doubled. The local workforce, the people who run the shops, clear the snow, and staff the hospitals, can no longer afford to live in the communities they serve. This is the hollowing out of rural Canada. It creates a ghost town effect, where houses are owned by investors or remote workers, while the actual community infrastructure crumbles because the service class has been pushed out. The pain here is visceral for those who have lived in these towns for generations, only to be told they are now too poor for their own hometown. The curiosity gap is, where do people go when even the affordable options are gone? We are seeing the start of a domestic migration that is changing the map of Canada.
The rent strike is growing. For the first time in decades, we are seeing organized tenant unions across Canada taking a stand. In cities like Toronto, entire buildings are refusing to pay rent increases that they deem above guideline. This is a high-stakes game of chicken with corporate landlords. The tenants argue that while their rents go up, the maintenance of the buildings goes down. Elevators are broken for months, mold is ignored, and security is non-existent. This is the decline of a vertical village. These rent strikes are a symptom of a breaking point. When people feel they have nothing left to lose, they stop following the rules. The legal battles are becoming legendary, and they are starting to shift the political conversation. But for the average renter, the fear of being blacklisted by tenant screening services keeps them quiet. There is a shadow blacklist that landlords use to flag troublesome tenants, making it nearly impossible for them to find housing in the future. This creates a culture of fear and silence. But as the crisis deepens, that fear is turning into anger. Is Canada headed for a period of social unrest driven entirely by the cost of shelter?
How does Canada compare to the rest of the world? We often compare ourselves to the US, but the reality is much worse here. If you look at the price-to-income ratios, Canadian cities are now consistently ranked as some of the most unaffordable on the planet, worse than New York, worse than London, and in some cases, rivaling Hong Kong. The difference is that those cities are global financial hubs with massive salaries to match. Canada has Hong Kong prices with Midwest salaries. This value gap is the core of the frustration. We are paying a premium for Canada, but what are we getting in return? Our healthcare system is under extreme stress, our infrastructure is lagging, and our productivity is declining. The Canadian brand is being tarnished by the fact that its citizens can't afford to live within its borders. This is leading to a brain drain 2.0. In the 90s, people left for better jobs. Today, they are leaving because they can't afford rent. We are losing our brightest minds, doctors, engineers, and entrepreneurs, to countries where their hard-earned money actually buys them a life. The curiosity loop. Which countries are the top destinations for the Great Canadian Exodus, and what do they know that we don't? The intergenerational wealth gap in Canada has created two different versions of reality. On one side, you have the equity rich, older Canadians who bought homes for $200,000 that are now worth $1.5 million. They are sitting on a mountain of untaxed wealth. On the other side, you have their children and grandchildren who are paying $30,000 a year in rent to live in a basement. This is the Great Divide. It has created a society where your success isn't determined by your hard work or your education, but by the luck of the birth year. If you were born in 1970, you are likely wealthy. If you were born in 1995, you are likely struggling. This is fundamentally un-Canadian. It creates a sense of inherited status. The only way many young people can enter the housing market is through an inheritance, which means wealth is becoming concentrated in fewer and fewer families. Those without generational wealth are being left behind in a permanent underclass. This social stratification is a recipe for long-term instability. The pain is not just financial, it's the death of the meritocracy. When the game is rigged by the date on your birth certificate, why play by the rules at all? The Great Canadian Exodus is no longer a theory, it's a data point. Recent polls suggest that a significant percentage of Canadians under 35 are seriously considering leaving the country. They are looking at places like the United States, where housing is cheaper and salaries are higher, or even parts of Europe and Southeast Asia, where they can live a high-quality life for a fraction of the cost. This is a silent hemorrhage. Every time a young professional leaves, Canada loses the tax revenue, the innovation, and the future family that person would have started. We are exporting our most valuable resource, our people. The irony is that we are replacing them with record-high immigration, creating a revolving door that doesn't solve the underlying problem. The curiosity gap here is, what happens to a country that can't house its own workers? We are entering uncharted territory. If the people who build the houses, fix the cars, and teach the children can't afford to live in the city eventually stops functioning. We are seeing the first signs of this in service deserts, neighborhoods where businesses are closing because they can't find staff who live close enough to work. What does the data say about the next 5 years? Unfortunately, the forecast is grim. Despite government promises to build more homes, the reality on the ground is that housing starts are actually declining in many regions due to high interest rates and labor shortages. We are digging the hole faster than we can fill it. The Bank of Canada is in a policy corner. If they lower rates to stimulate building, they risk reigniting a speculative housing bubble. If they keep rates high, they keep the pressure on renters and developers. There is no soft landing for the rental market. We are likely to see a continued consolidation of ownership, where more and more of Canada's housing stock falls into the hands of institutional investors. This means market rent will continue to be decoupled from local wages. We are moving towards a neo-feudal model, where a small class of owners collects rent from a large class of landless workers. The visceral pain of this realization is starting to set in. The Canadian dream isn't just on life support, it's being replaced by a much darker reality.
But there is one factor that could change everything, a black swan event that no one is pricing in.
This black swan could be the great deleveraging. For years, the Canadian economy has been propped up by housing. It is our biggest industry. But a system built on ever-increasing debt and ever-increasing rents is inherently unstable. If the rent-induced poverty line is crossed by too many people at once, the consumption-based economy collapses. If people can't afford to buy anything because all their money goes to rent, the businesses that employ them start to fail. This is the Ouroboros economy, the snake eating its own tail. We are seeing the early signs of this in the retail and hospitality sectors. The curiosity gap is, when does the bubble pop? It might not be a sudden crash like in 2008, but a long decay, a slow, painful decline in the standard of living that lasts for decades. This is what happened in Japan, and the parallels are striking. High debt, aging population, and an obsession with real estate. But Canada has one thing Japan didn't, a massive influx of new people. Is this our salvation, or is it just adding fuel to the fire? The answer depends on whether we start treating housing as a human right or continue to treat it as a speculative asset.
As we wrap up this deep dive, the truth about rent in Canada is clear. It is a systemic crisis that goes far beyond supply and demand. It is an emotional, financial, and social weight that is crushing the spirit of a nation. We've seen how the CRA, the BOC, and institutional investors have created a financial cage for the middle class. We felt the pain of the rent eviction and the math of the permanent renter. But the most important question remains: what are you going to do about it? Whether it's moving provinces, leaving the country, or joining a tenant union, the wait-and-see approach is no longer viable. The shadow fact we started with, the rent-to-income ratio, is only going to get worse unless there is a fundamental shift in how Canada functions. The curiosity loop we leave you with is this: in 5 years, will you still be able to afford the roof over your head, or will you be part of the great exodus? The data is there, the warnings are loud, and the choice is yours. This is the reality of Canada in 2024. It's worse than you think, but knowing the truth is the first step toward survival. Subscribe as we continue to track the collapse of the Canadian dream and look